Hey guys, Mr. Ree here, and today we are taking a look and rounding out this mini-series on class reworks with the last class that I have yet to touch on, which is of course the Psyker. Good job at sussing that one out, guys. Sus. The Psyker is probably the least likely to receive a rework, in my opinion. I think it's probably most people's opinion at this point. The Psyker has had some pretty recent touch-ups to their tree. You can see that at a glance just by looking at their tree here and seeing how interconnected it is and how many nodes and a variety of playstyles that it sort of encourages. And then looking at the Ogren, a classic updated talent tree, we can see that there's a very similar amount of interconnectivity and options available to you as the player, and that alleviates a ton of issues that some more linear paths like the Zealot, who's got the most outdated tree, is facing. Now, I will mention here that if you didn't see my other two videos on the Zealot and the Veteran respectively, you should go check those out. I'll summarize them here for you, but you should go watch them. They're a good watch. You get to hear me yap, and I'll explain to you why those talent trees and why their design is just outdated and needs a little bit of a rework. So I'll talk about it here. Also, you should subscribe to the channel and help the channel grow to Warhammer 40k subs before the end of the year. That'd be pretty sick as well. But for today, we're talking Psyker, and like I was saying, the Psyker doesn't suffer from a lot of the issues that the Veteran and Zealot do, which is good. Unfortunately, the Psyker is pretty low down in the power rankings. I would rank them either dead last or just ahead of Veteran, but only just barely ahead of Veteran. They've got a couple of things, namely their staves, that are buoying their power a good bit. If you removed Void Blast Staff and the Flame Staff from the Psyker, they would be dead in the water. The Psyker would be pretty much hopeless without those two things. Versus removing any weapon from Veteran probably wouldn't have a great effect. Even if you removed the Recon Lasgun and the Plasma Gun, he'd still have other stuff he could play with and do a similar role. But the Psyker is so dependent on their staves being unlimited ammo, infinite cleave weapons, that it's very hard to balance this class. So I don't envy Fat Shark's responsibility to balance it, because this is a glass cannon, and when you're building a glass cannon character, you have to balance the glass with the cannon, right? For right now, in the current 2025, September 2025 edition of Psyker, who knows if this is going to change in the future, but Psyker is a little bit too much glass for my taste and for pretty much anybody's taste. If we look at classes as a whole, Psyker is uniquely vulnerable to dying and getting downed. They are the only class outside of Veteran who somehow manages to overheat the plasma gun that can take their own life. They can manage to just make a simple mistake and cause themselves to get a down or even a death as a result. They are also extremely fragile. Every other class has a way to survive some sort of cataclysmic thing happening to them, except for the Psyker. So the Veteran and the Zealot, the Veteran has gold toughness, which can prevent an overhead from crushing you and killing you. From any amount of gold will protect you. The Zealot obviously has his cores, which will give him gold, but also he's got Until Death, so he can be protected against death effects that way. The Ogren just has far too much HP and toughness damage reduction to be put down in one hit by almost any enemy in the game, and so he's just incredibly absurdly tanky in that regard. And the Arbites, of course, has things like True Grit, which can cap the damage he takes at 50 damage per hit. Every other class has some way of stemming a huge catastrophic fuck up and stopping it from turning into, oh shit, I'm just dead, except for the Psyker. The Psyker is very, very fragile, not only to their own mistakes, but to the aggression of enemies. And you pretty much rely on your team to help you through the game. You can be a valuable asset of the team. I won't take that accolade away from Psykers, but you rely on your team a lot more on the Psyker than you do on other classes. And that's a good big portion of why, when you look at the amount of true solos that are out there in the world, you go search Darktide true solos. 99% of these true solos are done with any class but Psyker. Psyker is by far the hardest class to true solo with in the game, because they depend on other classes to make space for them, to keep bosses off of them, to do boss damage, because they're not really an amazing class at that. They've got a lot of strengths, but they've got a lot of weaknesses as well. I don't think, though, from my perspective, that the problem, and by the way, as you can tell by the gameplay in the background, which surely is Havoc 40, don't question it, it's definitely Havoc 40, is my experience with Psyker is pretty limited, but I think I'm doing a pretty good job at ascertaining what the weaknesses here are and what the thing that needs to be worked on in order to bring Psyker up to snuff would be. If you are a more experienced Psyker than I, which means if you've ever played Psyker for 10 or 15 minutes, you should let me know in the comments if you think I'm missing some element of this puzzle here. But I'm going to do my best. I've been thinking about this for a while. There's two main issues for the Psyker that he's facing currently. One is that so much, as I spoke at the beginning, so much of his power is tied up in those weapon choices. If you are not using Flame Staff or Void Blast Staff, you are missing like at least 30% of the potential power cap of the class, and this is a problem for balancing, because how do you balance, and this is an issue I've talked about previously with other talents and other weapons in the game, but how do you balance the class when the class has access to the fucking staff of flame doom that can erase an entire horde, no matter if it's 10,000 enemies strong, as long as you have correct positioning, versus infantry auto gun, right? You could use a gun that uses ammo, uses resources, and can kill like 3 enemies with a mag, or you've got a infinite ammo flamethrower that just requires like touching your hand to your temple for a second to reload, more or less. So balancing around the fact that he has access to these crazy infinite cleave, high DPS, lingering dot effect weapons is very difficult. And that means that Fat Shark has to be scared about giving this guy too much cannon and not enough glass. And I think that's why they're veering on the side of glass for him. There's not a whole lot of talents in the tree that buff your damage really at all with Psyker. That's why talents such as Warp Rider are in almost every single Psyker build, because Warp Rider is one of the only like legitimate damage increases that the class has, or one of the biggest ones anyway. When we look at other classes like Ogryn, there are a fuck ton of like nodes in here that are like, where is it? We got attack speed, we get rending, we get where's my ones? Oh yeah, it's like 15% melee damage on a successful heavy attack, 15% charged damage when you charge up your attack, 15% more damage taken by enemies, 15% extra damage when you dodge or get hit by an attack, right? You see where I'm going here. And the Arbites is this, but to even more comical degree, where he has like no joke, like no less than 9 different abilities that give him 15% or more damage. So there's just so much damage stacking on these classes, because they have a set of weapons that are playing within the bounds. Like, you know, you get the Ogre in a Bully Club. How much damage is he really going to do, right? The Bully Club is capped, but the Flame Staff isn't, or the Void Blast Staff isn't. So if you give him 50% increased damage, now he's doing 50% increased damage to 100 enemies at the same time. It becomes a runaway problem. So that's why his like increases to his damage are very low, and this is a big problem for this class and dealing with high health enemies like bosses, where he doesn't have a whole lot of ways of like really boosting his damage against these enemies. So that's one issue, is like, just to summarize it, because I know I rambled a little bit there, but to summarize it, the class has to be constructed around the fact that the high performing weapons in the class are literally some of the most high performing weapons in the game. They are weapons that have infinite cleave and can do infinite damage as long as you keep yourself safe. So they can't give this class a whole lot of like offensive or defensive talents on the tree that can further enable the Flame Staff to do even more Flame Staff nonsense. The second issue facing the Psyker's design is an over-specialization in terms of its talents, and an interconnectivity between the talents and what weapon you use in like a bad way, in a negative way, right? Normally, your talents further enable your weapon choices, which does continue in the Psyker, but the Psyker has these super specialized talents that only apply to certain weapons and not others. They don't play nicely with all weapons. Let's look at the Ogryn as an example of a generalized talent tree. And let's just pick the latrine shovel. Let's say I'm going to go for a latrine shovel build right here. If I went for a latrine shovel, Grenadier Gauntlet build, Every single node in this tree, literally every single one, would have some applicability to my build. Because there's explosives down here, right? So we've got that for our grenades and for our grenade launcher. We've got extra ammo for that. We've got sway reduction stuff. We've got stuff for our melee. Literally every single node in this entire tree is applicable to those 2 weapons chosen at random. If you chose weapons at random, the only time you would run into any sort of conflict where the nodes aren't applicable would be like the non-explosive weapons with these 2 nodes right here, the explosive radius and the burn stacks on explosion. But that's it. Outside of that, every build gets value out of every node in this tree. When we come to Psyker, the same cannot be said. The Psyker's tree relies on you playing with certain types of weapons that can do certain things, and if they can't do those things, then you can't make that. I mean, you can, but making that talent choice is going to literally provide you nothing. A great example of this is if your build cannot apply Soul Blaze, if you don't have a Flame Staff, if you don't have Soul Blaze on like Elite Killer, if you didn't pick this node and you don't have Soul Blaze in your weapon, well then Wildfire literally doesn't do anything. So you get to here and then you only have one choice. Same thing happens over here. If you are using a gun, if you're making a gun Psyker and you're going down this way to Scryer's Gaze, well you get to here and this one is Quell Speed. So this one's the choice, right? Like, and this happens to gun psychers all the time because gun psychers come over to this side to get to prescience. So you get to here and the choice is made for you because you are using a gun. This is the only one that gives you benefits when you're using a gun. If you are not using a staff, then this whole wing over here is useless to you. If you are not using a staff, then this whole bottom area here is pretty much, this whole ability is useless to you, more or less, right? If you're not using a gun that can hit headshots, then Disrupt Destiny is useless to you. And like, let's take this as an example, right? If I was, for instance, a new player and I grab the Flame Staff and I come all the way down the bottom, I want to do this one because Disrupt Destiny has a lot of cool stats on it. That seems cool. I come here, 5% crit chance. Okay, yay. I come here. Okay, my choice is non-warp range critical. Well, this doesn't do anything with the Flame Staff. This one does. Okay, it doesn't help my Flame Staff, but okay, I'll pick it. Okay, coming down here. Okay, Surety of Arms and True Aim. Okay, so both of these nodes, literally, if you're using the Flame Staff, they do not provide you anything. They can't be activated if you're using Flame Staff. So there are certain weapons, when you equip yourself with them, you are locking yourself off from parts of this tree, and vice versa. If you build into certain things in this tree, you are saying, by default, I will not be using these weapons. And this is like, you know, Scryer's Gaze is a great example of this, right? If you're using Scryer's Gaze, you're either left-clicking with like your staff, you're shooting with a gun, or you're going melee, and that's it. The Scryer's Gaze has a ton of cool stats and stuff, but it's just not effective. It doesn't do anything for like right clicks or like channels on staffs. And the same thing applies to Venting Shriek. If you don't have a way of generating tons of peril, which means using a staff, then Venting Shriek is not a good ability for you. And Warp Siphon isn't going to be good for you because this scales your warp damage. So if you're not using warp stuff, if you're not going to use blitzes, then you just don't choose Empowered Psionics. So like for most classes, for most builds, you don't want to use your blitzes a ton. You want to use your staff. So Empowered Psionics ends up being just a dead keystone. And if you're not using a ranged weapon that can hit headshots, then Disrupt Destiny is a dead keystone. So that's what I'm saying here, is the choice is pretty much made for you by choosing your weapon in terms of which nodes that you can and can't use. And that removes a ton of options from this tree. Let's go back again and mentally compare it to Arbides, right? Almost every node in the entirety of the Arbides tree is applicable to anything he might be using. There's things like crit chance and headshot damage and cooldown reduction. Like, even if you're not using a dog, you can still use the keystone that is primarily focused around using the dog, right? The only argument for the Arbides would be like that whole Terminus Warrant middle keystone is janky with most weapons, but like things like Forceful, that works with every melee weapon, right? It's super, super generalized. And I think the reasoning for this ties back into the first thing we talked about with the Psyker, where the reason that they have a low general like power boost level is because they are scared to give power boosts to those OP high performing weapons. The same thing applies here. These talents are hyper specialized because what they're doing is they are trying to trace a line right around the edge of the Flame Staff and by a lesser extent the Void Blast Staff, because they don't want to accidentally splash a bunch of power onto those weapons that if they got like power-ups, they would just end the game. They would just decimate everything. If you had a Psyker tree that was designed like the Arbites tree is, where there's like 6 to 9 or however many fucking 69, nice, however many fucking 15% damage boost there is, and then you gave them the flame staff, can you even imagine, right? That's why this tree is designed in this way, where there's like certain abilities and certain stuff that isn't used with other stuff. It's because they have to be very, very careful not to accidentally give a ton of fucking power into the hands of these weapons that absolutely don't need it. So that's the takeaway here, guys. The big problem is that the Psyker has the potential to be like game-breakingly powerful because of the multiplicative, infinite cleave, high damage, infinite ammo, DPS capabilities of these stabs, and therefore the class needs to be kept tamped down in terms of its defensive, survivability, and offensive capabilities so as not to further exacerbate that issue. And what are they going to do about it, right? I don't know. I think the surest thing to do would be to put some sort of like hit cap on the flame staff to bring its power down so that you can like buff everything else about the class. Like literally everything else could get a huge buff because the flame staff is no longer going to be a threat to like break the entire game. The other thing I meant to talk about here is the problem with having these like abilities that are very clearly linked to certain playstyles. It like pigeonholes them, it links them together, and then when one of them fails, when one of them doesn't like kind of hack it out at a higher difficulty, it just unravels everything else. So this is a great example with like Scryer's Gaze, right? Scryer's Gaze is a cool ability. It doesn't like feel very cool for anybody except for the person using it, but it's a powerful ability that is great on gun psychers and great on like melee, like crack psychers. But when you reach higher havoc, there's far too many threats on the battlefield for most people to be using Scryer's Gaze with melee psycher. Gun psycher takes too much ammo to use it effectively, so Scryer's Gaze loses a lot of its appeal and a lot of its efficacy. And when Scryer's Gaze takes a nosedive in terms of really being able to be used that difficulty, so does Gun Psyker as a whole. So does like everything else. All those other nodes that you would have picked if you were going Scryer's Gaze, like Disrupt Destiny, just straight out of there, right? Same thing applies to Venting Shriek, right? Venting Shriek and Scryer's Gaze to a lesser extent, they don't give you enough extra damage to whatever build style you might be playing to outweigh the general utility of Telekine Dome. And this is maybe the biggest problem for the ability section here, which is that if we look at the Ogren, right, this is my big problem with Point Blank Barrage. Point Blank Barrage doesn't give you enough utility and power to any given range weapon that you're using to outweigh the benefits of just using Loyal Protector instead. So it ends up being just a dead ability. You would have 90, 85, 90% of the damage if you were just using Loyal Protector instead. And same thing applies with the Psyker. Could you get a little bit extra damage using Venting Shriek with your Flame Staff build? Absolutely, sure, yeah, it'd be great. But is that little bit of extra damage going to outweigh the safety and security that you can provide yourself and the entire team by having Telekine Domes up every 15 seconds? Absolutely not. Same thing applies to Scryer's Gaze. Can you pop off and do, millions of damage with Scryer's Gaze? Probably not, but like you can get some pretty good damage out of it. Is it going to be better than just using Telekine Shield? No. And so when these two things fall away in terms of their usefulness, so do builds that want to rely on like Venting Shriek and adding these flame stacks and getting the cooldown with Warp Siphon. So do builds that rely on getting headshots and going Disrupt Destiny. So they kind of all are linked together, and then they drag each other down when one of them can't hack it at a certain difficulty or is proven to just like not be as powerful. And so yeah, you end up, even though this is a great tree with a lot of diversity and a lot of choices, it gets steered back towards that mono build because there are powerful choices on both the equipment side and the talent side, and those two things happen to coincide. You can use the Flame Staff with Telekine Shield, and that defines the meta for the class, is use those two things together, and then you pick the things that work with the Flame Staff, and you don't pick the things that don't. And then you would just end up having like the build that just goes, there you go, done. So what would a talent tree rework look like if it did come to fruition? Well, firstly, I don't have high hopes for a talent tree rework coming in. It definitely wouldn't be super big or in-depth. I don't think the Psyker really needs, like, they definitely don't need a physical overhaul of the tree. It's well enough connected. But my problem is that there's so many weak junk talents in here that either have no effectiveness on many builds or just obviously not going to be chosen because they're right next to something else that's a way better choice, and they require like too many qualifiers to pick. So I think that a lot of those junk nodes could be replaced. The same thing I would like to see happen with, I honestly don't have any problem with any of the blitzes. A sail should see a big power boost personally. I think what would be cool for a sail is if a sail had like orbiting shards that floated around you and just hit enemies, like kind of like the dog does. The dog doesn't contribute a ton of kills passively, but like it's pretty useful. So if the assail shards just casually orbited you and killed stuff even when you weren't actively throwing them, that would be pretty sick. That would give them a lot of value to pick them instead of picking Brain Rupture every single time because it's on the bad side of the tree. The same thing needs to happen with just like talents in general throughout here. There's just like choices between talents here, like Wildfire versus Psychic Aura, where like one of these is God tier, one of them is crap tier. The abilities are also a bit lopsided, where Telekine Dome is just kind of the obvious pick. It's just such a general use case. You've got an ability here that provides safety for you and the entire team, and it's so easy to use, it's so brain dead to use, and it's just great. It's an awesome ability. It's not OP, but it's just a really, really solid defensive ability. It reminds me a lot, honestly, of Ogren and his taunt ability, where it's like, yes, I could squeeze a little bit more damage out of my build by running Indomitable and getting hyper aggressive, right? I could squeeze more damage out of my range build by running Point Blank Barrage and just bombarding enemies with explosions. But I could also get like, 20%, 15, 20% less damage and just be Omega safe. Just have tons of toughness regeneration and taunt everything in the world and, make them take extra damage while I'm at it. Yeah, I'll just choose taunt every single time, more or less. It's the same issue going on here where, like, yes, Venting Shriek would give you extra damage if you're running a Flame Staff build or like a staff build in general. Same thing as your Scry's Gaze. If you're running a crack Psyker build with melee, if you're running a gun Psyker build, Scry's Gaze can give you a lot of damage potential, but does that potential for damage on either one of these abilities outweigh the general safety and utility of the bubble? The answer in 99.9% of cases is no, unless you're godlike cracked at this game. And the same thing also applies to the shield variants, the non-dome side that you never see anyone take. Are these shields useful and they can block bullets from a direction, like actually kind of make like game-changing plays? Absolutely. Does the trade-off of losing your dome that protects you from all directions and regenerates your toughness outweigh that change? No. You would always choose the dome. So I would love to see these guys be brought up. In terms of power, I don't think they should nerf the bubble. I think the bubble is a perfectly balanced ability, but these things need to be brought up in power and utility a lot to make them relevant. And the scary thing, I think, there for them is that these things are power boosts. And if you power boost this class, if you give them power boosts, they're going to find a way to use it with the Flame Staff, use it with the Void Blast Staff, use it with something exploitable, and get crazy, crazy damage for free because staves have infinite ammo. Same thing again needs to go for the keystones, where like these keystones are not exactly created equally. A ton of these nodes down here just don't like. Finally, they fixed penetration of the soul, so it actually works. But like, there are so many nodes on this tree, and I'll wrap it up here. But there are so many nodes in this tree that are just not going to be your choice ever, right? You are never going to choose Puppet Master, Radius for your Coherency Aura, ever. Like, why would you choose that? You're not going to choose Unlucky for Some, ever. And if you're using certain weapons, there's a ton of other things that you're just not going to choose ever, right? So you're automatically saying like, no, I'm definitely not choosing at least 25% of this tree. I'm just absolutely not choosing. And that limits your choices a lot. So I think that they should really just get back in here and look at upping the power of a lot of these lesser chosen nodes. I'm certain they must have data on like a heat map for what is actually chosen across many, many, many multiple player accounts. And that would probably help them a long way in terms of figuring out what is used and what isn't. Because right now, I'll tell you, there's a pretty small subset, even for as interlinked as this tree is, that is actually used. And it's all tied back to those power weapons, right? It all, like, it all trickles down to Flame Staff and to a lesser extent Void Blast Staff at the end of the day, where it's like, yes, you can do more damage with guns, I guess, technically, and you can do some pretty crazy stuff with swords and all that, but you know, Flame Staff is free, and it's easy as fuck to use. So, yeah, I don't know if they should nerf Flame Staff to balance the class, but it might help. And, you know, I guess I'll leave you with that, guys. Subscribe, and come around next time. I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I'll be back soon. There's more Darktide content on the way, but I appreciate you for watching, and that's Mr. E getting out of here. Bye-bye.